The final reading is Matthew chapter 14, verses 22 to 33. Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead to the other side, while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone, but by this time the boat, battered by the waves, was far from the land, for the wind was against them. And early in the morning he came walking towards them on the lake. But when the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified, saying, "It is a ghost!" And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." Peter answered them, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." He said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat, started walking on the water, and came towards Jesus. When he noticed the strong wind, he became frightened, and, beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him, saying to him, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" When they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
So, storms. We've had a bit of a weather storm this week. It's been pretty miserable and cold and wet. Storms can be very violent. Storms cause damage and destruction. And in the story we've just heard in Matthew's Gospel, there's a bit of a storm going on as the disciples are trying to row across Lake Galilee at night. Most of us, given the choice, would be inside during a storm. We'd hunker down. We'd watch the storm from the calm and quiet and comfort of our homes. But when you're out in a storm, you don't always have that opportunity. And it's hard to know what's going on, it's hard to see, and all you're really trying to do is get through the storm to the other side. Well, we find ourselves living through a major storm at the moment. It's a different storm to the one with wind and rain, but it's a storm nevertheless. And the storm I'm talking about, of course, is COVID-19 that's affecting not just our lives, but the lives of virtually everyone across the whole world. And in some ways, it's a kind of perfect storm because it's affecting people's health and our hospitals and our medical system, but it's also affecting people's lives in other ways. Many people have lost their jobs. It's affected people's mental health as we struggle through this sort of period of isolation and we're feeling disconnected from perhaps our children and grandchildren and those we love. It's changing the way we work. And so it feels like this major storm shaking the foundations of our lives and even our society. And it's fair enough then to ask questions, key questions, such as where is God in the midst of this storm? What's God up to as this coronavirus pandemic affects the whole world? They're good questions to ask. They don't have simple answers, of course. But today's gospel story, and indeed all of our readings, speak to the situation that we find ourselves in. So in the gospel story, the disciples are on a boat in the middle of a lake in a storm. Jesus isn't with them, they're alone. And so one of the ways of interpreting this story that's been passed down to us is that their experience is the experience of the church. It's our experience. We don't have the luxury of walking in the direct presence of Jesus. And so the image of the boat out on the water, battling against the waves and the wind, is seen in lots of ways as an image of discipleship and of the church. And indeed, one of the early symbols of the church was a boat. And it's still the symbol of the World Council of Churches, is a boat. And in this sort of interpretation and this way of viewing the story, it's kind of like the church adrift on this wide ocean of the world. And it's understandable then that life will sometimes be difficult. We will sometimes be afraid. We will sometimes have doubts. We will sometimes get tired. We will struggle. And during these times, God may indeed feel quite distant from us. And perhaps that's some of your experience of what we're living through at the moment with COVID-19, that you do have anxieties, you do have doubts as to how this is going to improve, how those rates of infection are ever going to come down, how we're going to get to the other side when we can resume a more normal life, where we can just go about our business without needing to wear a mask, without having to keep distant from people, when we could even meet together as a church community again. So it is, in some ways, a struggle at the moment. The promise from this interpretation of the story is that Jesus is still watching out for us. Jesus is still praying for us, but it can feel like we're all alone. So one of the things I came across this week that I've put in the newsletter, so it's on the front page here, was a piece by Beth Barnett, who's a member at North Ringwood Uniting Church, of how we might approach these next 6 weeks of this stage 4 lockdown. What sort of challenges it's going to throw up for us, what some of our responses might be. So I commend that piece to you. I think it's a very helpful reflection. And it ends on the note that, yes, these are going to feel like 40 days in the wilderness. So it's going to be tough. But is there more to this story? Is there more in our readings that we need to hear? And there is, because there's the second half of the gospel story, and then there's that story from Kings as well, that God is present with us in every circumstance. Sometimes God will be present in the silence, like it was for Elijah. We may look for some drastic intervention from God, but no, God is with us just in the quiet of our hearts, speaking to us, speaking words of peace and love. In the gospel story, though, Jesus comes to the disciples in the midst of the storm. So the wind is howling, the waves are crashing, and Jesus comes to the disciples. And his words are basically, have courage, don't give up. I'm right here with you. And the words he says in the Greek, it is I, which could be translated as I am, which is in fact the sacred name of God revealed to Moses at the burning bush. So I am is with you. We might recall also all the I am sayings in the Gospel of John. This is the Jesus who comes to us. This is the Jesus who embodies the character and the love of God. And the hope of the story is that Jesus does indeed come to us in the midst of our difficulties and struggles. And what to do then? Well, Peter has an idea. Good old Peter, my namesake. I'll get out of the boat and come to you, Jesus. I'll come and stand next to you on the water. So whether you think Peter is being incredibly courageous or foolish or full of faith, and maybe it's all of those wrapped up together, he gets out of the boat and he starts walking towards Jesus. But then he looks around at his circumstances and he suddenly gets scared and starts to sink. Jesus grabs him, they get in the boat together. The wind calms down. What's actually changed? Well, the boat's still out in the middle of the lake. It's still nighttime. But because of the presence of Jesus and the knowledge that Jesus is with them, the disciples are now at peace. They know they can get through this together. So one of the questions I've written on the notes today is, are we better off with Jesus present with us or not present with us? Are we in fact in a better place than the disciples or in a worse place? And I guess that depends how you think about it. But one of the aspects of this Gospel of Matthew is that Jesus is named Emmanuel right at the start of the Gospel. And right at the very end of the Gospel, Jesus says to the disciples, look, I'm going to be with you always. Whatever struggles you face, whatever storms you're in, I am going to be there with you. And that's the inner peace that we can know that, yes, we can get through the storms of life. Jesus is with us, and we also have the comfort and encouragement of those around us, the community of faith. And knowing those things, we can indeed live with courage, and we can live with hope, and we can live with kindness and love towards others, because we know we are not alone, and we don't have to struggle through this storm alone. So however difficult we may find these next few weeks, and I'm sure for all of us there will be times where we get a bit down and a bit blue, they're the times to stop and pray. And they're also the times to reach out, just as Peter reached out, and call for help. So don't suffer alone, but remember that you have friends and that you have colleagues who are around you and able to reach out and help you. Amen.